I never imagined that the steady rhythm of my life could be disrupted by something so seemingly small. A favor. That's how it started. My husband suggested it casually between sips of his morning coffee, the same dark roast he drank every day without enthusiasm, without change. His voice was calm, nearly lost beneath the clink of his spoon against the ceramic rim. It would help him get on his feet, he said. He's good with his hands. Could fix the fence, maybe take care of the garage door. I nodded. There was no reason not to. We'd known Mark for years, my husband's adoptive grandson from his first marriage. Though he had once been a boy trailing awkwardly behind the adults at family gatherings, he'd become a man in the time since I'd last seen him. The kind of change that slips in quietly, unnoticed until it's standing in your doorway. That morning, when Mark finally did arrive, I was surprised by how much had shifted. His smile when he stepped through the door was easy, familiar, but different somehow. A quiet confidence lingered beneath the surface, like a man who had figured out his place in the world. His handshake was firm, his eye contact steady, but not showy, just present. I noticed all of it before I had a chance to think through why. My husband led him outside to show him the work, pointing out the broken latch, the chipped paint, the tilt in the gate. They spoke in practical tones, efficient and impersonal, the way men do when discussing tools and repairs. I watched them from the kitchen window, my fingers tracing slow circles around the rim of my coffee mug. There was a strange feeling in my chest, like something leaning forward inside me, listening. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was awareness, a shift. That evening, I stood at the closet longer than I needed to, choosing a dress I hadn't worn in months. The fabric was soft, the straps thin, fluttering slightly as I moved. I told myself it was the heat. Summer pressing in through open windows, the air thick and unmoving. But some part of me knew better. We ate on the terrace, the three of us. My husband spoke about work, about the upcoming conference he needed to attend. His voice followed the usual rhythm of schedules and obligations, falling into the same familiar grooves. I nodded at the right moments, offered small replies, but my eyes drifted more than once across the table to Mark. He sat easily in his chair, one arm resting along the back, a faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. He looked comfortable in his skin in a way I hadn't noticed before. His gaze met mine only once during dinner, but it lingered a moment too long. Not improper, not overt, just long enough to feel it. After the meal, my husband excused himself to take a few calls. I stayed behind, gathering the dishes. I heard the quiet sound of footsteps behind me as Mark approached. "Let me help," he said, reaching for the plates in my hands. Our fingers brushed, barely. A light, unremarkable touch. But it stayed with me longer than it should have, the warmth of it lingering against my skin. That night, in bed beside my husband, I couldn't sleep. The ceiling above me felt too still, too quiet. I shifted under the sheets, restless. I told myself I needed water. That's all, just a glass of water. I slipped out of bed, my feet silent against the floorboards as I moved down the hall. As I passed the guest room, I paused. The door was slightly ajar. From inside, I heard the soft sound of humming, low, tuneless. The shuffle of feet, the creak of old wood beneath his steps. And then, the faint rush of water as the shower turned on. I stood still, not out of choice, but because something inside me had frozen. This was an ordinary moment, someone preparing for bed, washing off the dust of the day. And yet, it felt disarmingly intimate, like I had crossed into a space not meant for me. I eventually forced myself back to bed, though my thoughts refused to quiet. My husband stirred slightly in his sleep, his hand slipping over my waist with the ease of long habit. Gentle, familiar. But my body remained tense, my mind still at that guest room door. I told myself it would pass. The next morning, light filtered through the blinds in long golden stripes. I moved through the kitchen on autopilot, the kettle, the toast, the soft scrape of utensils. My husband had already left. He kissed my cheek on his way out, brief and routine. I paused at the hallway mirror. My reflection stared back, hair tied up, a hint of color on my lips. A version of me I hadn't seen in a while. I told myself it was just for me, just to feel a little more awake. Out back, Mark was already at work on the fence. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, arms flexing with each measured swing of the hammer. He looked focused, unaware of me standing there on the porch. I stepped down toward the garden with the laundry basket, trying to occupy myself with small tasks. As I clipped clothes to the line, I felt it, that gaze. Not accidental, not casual. It settled on my back like a whisper. I didn't turn around immediately. I kept my eyes on the clothespins, my pulse louder than it should have been. When I finally looked, he was watching. "Morning's warmer than I expected," he said, voice easy. "It is," I replied, barely louder than the breeze. He didn't return to his work. Instead, he walked toward me, slowly, deliberately, not too close, but close enough that I could feel his presence in a way that made it hard to breathe evenly. "You look different today," he said. I didn't answer. I focused on the next piece of laundry, fingers steady despite the tremble I felt rising in my chest. There was a pause, long enough for the moment to stretch taut between us. "I'm sorry about last night," he said at last. "If I crossed a line." He was offering me a way out, a neat ending. I could have taken it. But instead, I looked at him, really looked. And I said the words before I could stop myself. "You didn't." He stepped closer, his hand lifting slightly, brushing against the curve of my arm. His fingers skimmed the bare skin of my shoulder, and I didn't move away. We stood there, both of us still. Then slowly, he leaned in. Before our lips could touch, I pulled away. More question than answer filled my head. His hand rested lightly near my jaw still, and he looked into my eyes as I pulled away. "This can't," I said, the words thick. "I know," he replied. But neither of us moved right away. I turned back to the laundry, my hands shaking as I gathered the fallen clothes. The sun continued to rise, the morning unchanged, but something within me had irrevocably shifted. The rest of the day passed in fragments, chores, small talk, the sound of my husband's voice over the phone. But nothing felt the same. The house, once comforting, now felt full of silence I didn't know how to fill. Mark moved through it like nothing had changed, calm, composed. But when I saw him, passing in the hallway or leaning against the doorway, the weight of that moment between us returned, heavy and unresolved. That night, my husband told me he'd be gone again soon. Another trip, another few days. I nodded, said all the right things. But part of me was already standing at the edge of something I couldn't name. And I wasn't sure I wanted to step back. The morning after felt too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't offer peace, but instead sharpens your attention to every small sound. The creak of the floorboards, the click of the toaster, the distant hum of a lawnmower on the next street over. I moved through the kitchen as if on autopilot, wiping down the counter that didn't need cleaning, straightening the salt and pepper shakers, refolding the dish towel. I told myself it was just another day. Outside, the summer sun was climbing higher, burning through the morning haze. I wrapped my fingers around my coffee cup and stood by the window. There, in the yard, Mark was already at work again. This time he was sanding the old gate, slow, rhythmic strokes that sent a fine dust into the air. His shirt clung slightly to the line of his back, his movements steady, unhurried. I watched for too long. When I finally pulled myself away, I focused on anything else. Laundry, bills, a grocery list I didn't need to make. But the memory of yesterday afternoon clung to me like humidity, sticky and inescapable. That near kiss, the weight of it, the way it had happened so softly, yet shifted everything. I kept playing it back in my mind, trying to reduce it to something harmless. A moment, a mistake. But even that felt dishonest. It hadn't felt like a mistake. It had felt like waking up. I didn't see Mark again until midday. The sound of his footsteps on the porch made my breath catch before I'd even turned around. He stepped into the kitchen, shoulders dusted with sawdust, wiping his hands on the hem of his shirt. "Just checking if you wanted anything from town," he said, voice casual. I need to pick up some paint and a new latch. I shook my head. I'm fine, thank you. He nodded, hesitated a second longer than necessary, then turned and left. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but the silence he left behind felt louder than before. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, my coffee cold in my hands. Later, I found myself lingering by the mirror in the hallway. I adjusted the sleeves of my blouse, smoothed the fabric, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear and watched the movement, as if studying someone else. My reflection didn't look different, but something inside me had shifted, tilted just enough to make everything feel unfamiliar. When I stepped outside to hang another load of laundry, the air was thick and still. I moved with slow precision, pinning shirts and pillowcases to the line one by one. I didn't hear Mark return, but I felt it. The subtle change in the air, the awareness that crept up my spine before he even spoke. "Looks like you've got a system," he said from behind me. I turned. He stood near the edge of the garden, hands in his pockets, watching me with the same steady gaze I was learning to recognize. Quiet, observant, never quite letting me look away. "It's just laundry," I said, half smiling. He nodded, but didn't move. "Still, you make it look like it matters." There was a pause between us, not uncomfortable, but full. I looked down at the clothespins in my hand, then back at him. "How's the fence coming along?" "Almost done," he said. "It's a little more stubborn than I thought, but I'll get there." "I'm sure you will." He stepped closer then, just enough to stand in the same patch of shade. I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, the faint scent of sawdust and soap. We weren't touching, but the nearness was enough to make my breath shallow. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I've been thinking about yesterday." I didn't reply. "I know it's not simple," he added. I didn't plan for any of this." "Neither did I." There was a silence after that, the kind that feels like a decision waiting to be made. I turned back to the laundry, reaching for another damp shirt, pretending that my hands weren't trembling slightly. "I don't want to make things harder," he said. "You didn't," I replied too quickly. He didn't push. He nodded once, then stepped away, back toward the gate. I didn't watch him go. That evening, my husband came home later than usual. He was tired, distracted, talking about flight times and emails he still needed to send. I reheated leftovers, poured him a glass of wine, offered the same soft attentiveness I always had. He didn't notice anything different. Or if he did, he didn't say. He told me he'd be leaving the next morning for a 3-day trip. A conference in the city, meetings he couldn't miss. I smiled and nodded, filling in the silences with the usual assurances. "Of course," I said. "Don't worry, I'll manage here." And I would. I always did. That night, I stood at the bathroom mirror for longer than usual, brushing my hair back, tracing the outline of my collarbone with the tips of my fingers. The nightgown I chose was one I hadn't worn in months. Soft fabric, understated. Not for anyone, I told myself. Just for me. Just to feel something different. I lay in bed beside my husband, listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing as he drifted off. My eyes stayed open. The ceiling above me felt impossibly far away. When I finally got up, the house was silent. I walked barefoot down the hallway and stepped out onto the terrace. The air was cooler now, tinged with the scent of jasmine from the garden below. Mark was already there. He stood near the railing, arms folded, looking out toward the darkened yard. When he heard the soft click of the door behind me, he turned. Neither of us spoke. I crossed the space between us slowly, unsure of what I was hoping for, what I was afraid of. The night wrapped around us like a secret, the silence between our steps louder than words. He looked at me, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if he had been expecting this, as if he had felt it too. "I shouldn't be here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But you are," he replied. I didn't move. My feet rooted to the wooden boards beneath me, my hands at my sides, open, uncertain. He stepped forward, stopping just close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. His gaze didn't waver. He wasn't asking, at least not out loud. But the question hung there anyway. I didn't answer. Instead, I let the silence carry us forward. The space between us narrowed, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. And then, gently, he reached for my hand. It was a simple gesture. No urgency, no drama. Just the quiet press of his fingers curling around mine. I closed my eyes. The weight of my choices settled somewhere deep in my chest. Not heavy exactly, but present. Real. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know what I wanted it to mean, but I knew I would not forget this moment. Not the stillness. Not the scent of jasmine. Not the feel of Mark's hand in mine beneath the hush of the summer night. When I finally let go, stepping back inside, I didn't look over my shoulder. But I could still feel his presence, like a warmth in the air that hadn't yet faded. The morning began like all the others. Sunlight filtered through the slats of the blinds, casting long, pale stripes across the kitchen floor. I moved through the same tasks I did every day, filling the kettle, spreading butter across warm toast, rinsing a coffee cup under the stream of water that never seemed to run hot enough at first. But everything felt different. My husband had left early, just after sunrise. His suitcase had waited patiently by the door the night before, zipped and upright, like a loyal dog ready to follow. He kissed my cheek before he went, his mouth brushing my skin with the kind of affection that had long since become routine. I returned the gesture, smiled, said, "Have a good trip," and watched him disappear through the door. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of something I didn't know how to name. I told myself I would spend the day catching up on things, sorting the linen closet, cleaning the fridge, maybe even pulling weeds from the garden beds. But I couldn't focus. My hands moved mechanically, folding towels with unnecessary precision, pausing too long between one task and the next. The silence of the house pressed in on me from all sides. By late morning, I found myself standing by the window again, the same coffee growing cold in my hands. Outside, the breeze stirred the leaves, and a pair of sparrows hopped along the fence line. The world looked ordinary. Still, unchanged. But I wasn't. When I heard the soft creak of the back door, my breath caught before I'd even turned around. Mark stepped into the kitchen like he had the day before, quiet and unassuming. His presence filled the space even when he didn't speak. "I'm heading to town to get some extra supplies," he said, his voice easy. "Need anything?" I shook my head. "Number, I'm good." He didn't press, just nodded and left. Still, the air in the kitchen felt charged afterward, as if the room remembered his presence even after he was gone. I stood there, unmoving, for a long time. Later that afternoon, I told myself I needed to get out of the house, just for a little while. I slid on a pair of flats, pulled a light sweater over my shoulders despite the warmth, and grabbed my keys. My plan was vague, maybe the grocery store, maybe the bookstore. I just needed movement. The streets of town were familiar, every crack in the sidewalk, every faded sign. I parked near the corner cafe, walked aimlessly past the flower shop, then turned into the small market I had visited hundreds of times before. I didn't expect to see him. He was standing by the shelf of canned goods, a basket in one hand, reading the label on a jar with mild interest. When he looked up and saw me, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or something close to it. I froze for half a second before forcing my feet to move forward. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said. "Same," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. We stood facing each other across the aisle, surrounded by cereal boxes and rows of bottled water. The fluorescent lights above us buzzed faintly. It should have been nothing, a coincidence, a brief exchange between two people who shared a kitchen that morning. But the moment stretched. "Need help carrying anything?" he asked, gesturing toward my empty basket. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice betrayed me. It wavered slightly, like a note held too long. We moved down the next aisle together, side by side, our conversation light. We talked about traffic, changes in the weather, whether the tomatoes had looked better last week than they did today. None of it mattered. His hand brushed mine once as we reached for the same box of tea. Neither of us apologized. The drive home was silent. He offered to carry my bag, and I let him, even though it held only a few small things. We didn't speak until we pulled into the driveway. "I didn't plan to run into you," he said, turning toward me in the passenger seat. "I didn't plan any of this," I replied. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw it. The same war I felt inside myself mirrored in his eyes. Wanting, restraint. The fragile thread between them stretched so thin it was ready to snap. "This is dangerous," I said. "I know." And then gently, he reached out. His fingers brushed the inside of my wrist with the lightest touch. I didn't pull away. He leaned closer, not rushed, not demanding, just near enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath when he spoke. "Tell me to stop." But I didn't. His lips found mine, careful at first, like he was asking a question. I answered without words. The kiss deepened, slow and certain, weighted with all the things we hadn't said aloud. When we pulled away, breathless, I rested my forehead against his. "We shouldn't," I whispered. "But we will," he answered. And we both knew he was right. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house like it was someone else's, each room too quiet, too clean, too familiar. I ran my hand along the kitchen counter, remembering the way he had looked at me there days earlier. How the silence between us had felt louder than any voice. I told myself I would stop. I told myself that this could still be undone. But each time I closed my eyes, I saw him, standing in the doorway, brushing the hair from my cheek, looking at me like I was someone worth seeing. The next morning, I moved through the routine on instinct. Coffee, dishes, a quick walk through the garden. The sky was clear, the sun bright, the breeze gentle through the open window. I sat at the kitchen table longer than I needed to, tracing the rim of my mug with slow, idle circles. The chair across from me was empty. I tried to push the thoughts away, to anchor myself in breakfast and radio music and the sound of the refrigerator humming softly. But none of it held. I was too aware of myself, of my body, of every breath, of the memory of his hand resting briefly at the small of my back. When I heard the back door open hours later, I didn't turn around. I knew it was him. "Got everything I needed," he said casually. "Paint, sandpaper, a few tools." I nodded, my eyes still on the swirling patterns in my coffee. "Good." He stood there for a moment longer, then left. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to reclaim something that felt normal. I wiped down surfaces that didn't need it. I organized the spice rack. I sat on the edge of the bed and folded laundry with deliberate care, each movement more about distraction than necessity. But nothing worked. The silence between my thoughts was filled with echoes of too many yesterdays. When the message came later that evening, short, simple, direct, I didn't hesitate. "Are you alone?" "Yes." I stood at the back door before he even knocked. The knock at the back door was soft, hesitant, almost polite. But I had been waiting. I opened it without a word. Mark stood there, one hand tucked into the pocket of his jeans, the other resting lightly against the doorframe. He didn't smile. He didn't have to. His presence filled the space between us like a current we had both learned to recognize. Quiet, steady, impossible to ignore. I stepped aside. He entered slowly, his gaze flicking briefly over me. The loose knot of my hair, the thin straps of the top I'd chosen with too much thought. He didn't speak, and neither did I. There was a stillness between us, not awkward, but expectant, like something long overdue. He moved toward me with careful steps, as if giving me a chance to change my mind, but I didn't step back. I didn't stop him. His hand lifted, fingers brushing the line of my collarbone. I closed my eyes, leaning slightly into the touch, the warmth of it grounding and dizzying all at once. "I shouldn't be here," he said. "I know," I answered. And then I moved closer, closing the last few inches between us. My hand found his, our fingers lacing together with the ease of something familiar. We stood there like that, the hush of the house wrapping around us, the only sound our breathing, uneven, quiet. He didn't kiss me right away. His eyes searched mine, waiting, asking without words. And I gave him the answer not with speech, but in the way I leaned in, the way my face tilted toward his, the way I didn't look away. When his lips did meet mine, the kiss was different than any before. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't hesitant. It was full of history, of longing, of things we had both tried too hard to pretend didn't matter. There was no performance in it, just truth. Afterward, we sat in the living room, the quiet around us thick and unspoken. His hand rested gently on my knee, his thumb brushing small circles, absent-minded and slow. We didn't talk about what it meant, about what came next. We just sat in it, the closeness, the weight of it all. "We can't keep doing this," I said finally, my voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. "I know," he said, but neither of us moved. When he left that night, I stood at the door long after it had closed, my hand still resting on the frame, my breath catching in my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply stood in the silence. The next morning, I woke early. The house was still. The sunlight crept across the floor in quiet lines, everything familiar and untouched. I moved through the motions: coffee, toast, dishes. I folded a blanket that didn't need folding. I opened the windows, and yet everything felt altered. The walls held a stillness that wasn't emptiness exactly, but something close, as if they knew something had happened within them that couldn't be undone. When my husband returned that afternoon, the house welcomed him like it always did. The suitcase thumped onto the hardwood. His voice filled the kitchen with stories about the trip, the meetings, the people. I stood at the counter, slicing an orange, nodding at the right moments. He asked about the garden, the weather, the neighbor's dog. I answered each question with practiced ease, but something inside me remained untouched, folded in, quiet. That night, as we lay in bed, his hand found mine beneath the sheets. I let him hold it, our fingers resting loosely together. His breathing soon deepened. I stared at the ceiling. I thought about Mark, not just about what had happened between us, but about the space it had opened inside me, about the way I had begun to see myself again, not as someone's wife or someone's routine, but as someone who still felt alive beneath the layers of responsibility and repetition. It wasn't about him, not entirely. It was about what I had forgotten I could feel. The next day passed in quiet order. I went to the store, answered emails, folded laundry. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror again, and this time, I looked longer. I didn't fix my posture. I didn't smooth my dress. I just looked. And I saw a woman who had changed. Not in the way others might notice, but in the way that mattered most. Internally. Irrevocably. When the message came, 3 days later, it was short. "Are you free?" I didn't answer right away. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the letters, my heart already answering before I'd typed a single word. "Come." He arrived not long after. This time there was no pause between us. No small talk, just the soft rustle of his footsteps, the way his eyes met mine. "This is the last time," I said, though I didn't believe it. "I know," he answered, and we didn't pretend any further. We sat on the couch, the light from the window casting soft patterns across the floor. He reached for my hand, and I let him. We talked about nothing for a while. Music, the weather, a movie he'd seen. It felt normal, easy, dangerous. When he left, he didn't look back, and I didn't stop him. But I stood at the window long enough to watch him disappear down the path. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband once again. His breathing slow, his hand resting across my stomach. I stared up at the ceiling and counted the seconds between heartbeats. I had crossed a line, not with a scream or a collapse, but quietly, deliberately, with full awareness. Nothing dramatic had happened, no confrontation, no confession. But I had changed. And change, once it begins, rarely stays contained. In the days that followed, I moved through my routine with care, but also with a strange kind of clarity. I paid attention to the way the light shifted through the trees. I noticed the warmth of the mug in my hands. I heard the sound of my own footsteps. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I thought of Mark. Not with guilt, but with a complicated kind of gratitude. Because he had reminded me of something I hadn't realized I had lost. Not him, me,